This video is brought to you by Nebula. In our video on the current state of polling released earlier this week, we demonstrated just how much of a perilous position the Tories are in right now. They entered the campaign on a 20-point polling deficit, and despite attempts to improve this, it appears that this polling deficit, at least at the time of writing, remains. The only saving grace for Sunak was that he wouldn't be running against popular right-wing figure Nigel Farage, as he originally announced that he wasn't going to run for Reform UK. Unfortunately for Sunak though, on Monday, Nigel Farage announced that he was going to U-turn on his previous statement, instead saying that he was going to take over as leader once again, and stand in the Clacton constituency. This comes as terrible news for Sunak. Only an hour before the surprise announcement, a new Redfield and Wilton poll put the Labour lead at 26 points, with the Tories on only 20%, which is the tied lowest poll number for the Tories on record while Sunak has been Prime Minister. Sunak really needs to be trying to close this polling gap, and Farage's standing will not make this any easier. So in this video, we're going to have a look briefly at who Reform UK are, why Farage has taken over as leader again and announced he's standing in Clacton, and what this means for both Reform and the Conservative Party. Before we get into it, you likely know that last night there was a major election debate between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. We didn't have time to integrate that into today's video, but we are about to record a podcast all about it, which will be released within a couple of hours of this video's release. So head over to the TLDR Podcast YouTube channel or subscribe to Bite the Ballot in your podcast app to listen. Thanks. Now, it's worth starting this video by explaining who Reform UK are. Established back in 2018, Reform UK is the successor to the Brexit Party, which itself was started by Nigel Farage following his resignation as leader of UKIP. In essence, Farage wanted a way to get back into mainstream politics without being attached to the plethora of scandals that had occurred at UKIP since his departure. At the end of 2020, Farage had announced that he'd applied to the Electoral Commission to rename the party to the Reform Party. Initially, the party's policies were centred around their opposition to coronavirus lockdowns. In 2021, Farage resigned as leader, and businessman Richard Tice took over. Tice developed Reform's policy platform and claimed that they would pursue policies that aim to lower the overall tax burden and decrease the amount of regulation imposed by the government. In their most recent policy platform, Reform promised 7 million people that they'd cut their income tax, alongside promising 1.2 million businesses that they'd cut their corporation tax. They would also increase the role of the private sector in relation to the NHS. They state that to achieve their promise of zero waiting lists, they would give people vouchers to go private elsewhere if they're not seen in a certain amount of time. Aside from economics, on social issues, Reform UK have tried to show that they're conservative too. They made an explicit commitment to protect children from inappropriate sex education, have committed to net zero immigration, and have said that they would leave the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, it's worth pointing out here that this is not their manifesto. Reform has not yet released that. However, it is a taste of what they'd do if elected. Anyway, let's move on and discuss what happened on Monday. Ever since the start of the campaign, Nigel Farage has been questioned about why he's not standing for election. He is, after all, one of Reform's greatest assets and most recognisable figure. One of the most high-profile challenges he's had on this was during his appearance on Question Time, when Piers Morgan repeatedly claimed that he'd bottled it. Now, since this appearance, Farage spoke out, claiming that he would be open to a conversation with the Tories if they gave him something for the huge favours he's given them over the years. He later claimed, though, that he was being sarcastic when he suggested this. Regardless, only a few days later, on Monday, Farage held a press conference in which he not only stated that he would take over the leadership of Reform UK from Richard Tice, but also that he'd be standing in the constituency of Clacton, which previously had an MP from UKIP from between 2014 to 2017. This is what Farage had to say about his candidacy.
And I'll tell you this, and you won't have got this yet, and the pollsters won't yet have picked this up, but I promise you, after 30 years of experience in this game, something is happening out there. There is a rejection of the political class going on in this country in a way that has not been seen in modern times. But the other thing that really shook me in a way last week were the number of people coming up to me on the street saying, Nigel, why aren't you standing? And I gave my logical, rational reasons for it. But I couldn't help, after each exchange, I simply couldn't help feeling that somehow they felt I was letting them down, that I wasn't standing up for these people in their millions who've stood with me, in some cases for many, many years. Election battles, referendums. And I guess I have been a champion for many of those people.
Now, as things stand, it's certainly possible that Farage wins his Clacton constituency. Polling from Survation in January demonstrated two scenarios in the constituency. One for if Farage stood there as the candidate, and one for if Anthony Mack, the presumed Reform candidate, stood in the constituency. It was predicted that Mack would garner 18% of the vote to the Tories' 37%, but Farage would achieve 37%, beating the Tories, who would be reduced to only 27%. The question on everyone's lips right now, though, is not so much about how Farage will do in his constituency, but how this Farage return will affect the country, specifically the Tory and Reform national vote share. While Reform members and candidates might be jubilant this morning about the news of Farage's return, the mood amongst Tories is reportedly dire. Tory candidates have apparently already expressed anger at the handling of the Farage situation by Sunak, with one telling The Telegraph that we should have done a deal with Farage or Reform and took the fight to Labour. And to be fair, there's good reason for this frustration. The latest YouGov MRP poll, which was conducted between the 24th of May and the 1st of June, predicted that the Tories would only win 140 seats total, giving Labour a 194-seat majority. This would be the largest majority ever achieved by Labour. Already, this is pushing the Conservatives into an existential crisis. This poll, though, was conducted before the news of Farage's return, something that will only make polling even worse for the Tories, with him likely enticing even more Tory voters to instead vote Reform. Polling guru Professor Sir John Curtis has explained that Farage's candidacy could cost the Tories as many as 60 seats in the election. For his part, Farage has claimed that he thinks that Reform could now overtake the Tories in the polls within only a week. Now, this seems incredibly ambitious, but it is worth pointing out that some polls have put Reform within only 6 points of the Tories in the last week. Now, it's worth pointing out that Reform overtaking the Tories in the polls wouldn't mean that they'd overtake them in the Commons. The UK voting system benefits more established parties who concentrate their vote share. Irrespective of this, though, it's hard to overstate just how devastating this news is for the Tories, and just how good this is for both Reform and for Labour. That's not the end of the story, though, and if you want to continue learning more, then check out Nebula News. Nebula News is our joint venture with Nebula, where the TLDR team curates a selection of videos that matter most in the world right now. No more feeling out of touch or not knowing what to say at events. On Nebula News, we help guide you through the news that matters most, using videos from a huge variety of creators, helping you find stories that matter and avoiding burnout. It's not just curated news content brought to you directly by us. Nebula also features loads of exclusive original content. That's things like Real Life Law's brand new series War Room, which every month runs you through a whole load of ongoing conflicts, keeping you in the loop. You can also watch every TLDR video on Nebula ad-free, and in many instances before they land on YouTube. Now, if you're already subscribed to Nebula, you can find the brand new Nebula News section at nebula.tv/news. And be sure to bookmark or save that link so you can use it as your TLDR-ified news homepage. If you're not a member already, then click the link in the description to sign up now. If you do, you'll get 40% off an annual plan by using our link. That's less than £2 a month. Plus, Nebula will know that you came from us, which really helps us out.